Nope.
Hi, this is Misha, and this video is going to be on the U.S. Marshal Service Gun. And we've got a, talking section coming up soon, but we wanted to shoot these guns. We were going to kind of interlace the shooting and kind of little reviews of these guns with just more of a historical background and some photos. The first one you saw us trying to fire is one of the Chinese-made IAC trench guns. Now, I used to sell direct from IAC about 5 years ago, and I sold a lot of these. And to my knowledge, none that I sold had any major issues. This one does. It's very unusual. Something walked out. Going to take it to the gunsmith tomorrow. Hopefully it's a small thing that can be fixed. This was a lightly used one that came in the store last week. It looked to have been unfired or very lightly fired, so it's in good shape. But what's happening after the first couple of rounds, something got out of whack and the bolt won't come back far enough to eject fully. And because of that, the elevator here, which is also doubling as your locking lug for your bolt, can't come down far enough to let a shell drop in from the tube onto it and then feed into the action. So in other words, it's a single shot that doesn't eject. So we'll do an update on this. I was expecting it to run fine. I owned one of these years ago myself and it ran great. I was even kind of thinking about keeping this one, but because it's in good shape. Hopefully it's a small issue, but we'll post an update once it gets back from the gunsmith. We have high hopes because this is a nice reproduction trench gun that doesn't cost a lot of money, and generally speaking, these were well made. Steel receiver, it's actually machined, 20-inch barrel with a heat shield, and even a reproduction kind of flaming bomb mark. Alright, we'll move on. But the U.S. is interesting, U.S. military is interesting in that it used shotguns in relatively large numbers. Certainly larger than really any other military in history. Most others just never caught on in large numbers. The shotgun as we know it today can be traced back to the blunderbuss. And something like a shotgun was used in the War of 1812 when soldiers would load their guns with what they called the buck and ball, which was a mixture of a large pellet, a large ball, and small shot. And this was pretty effective. Other shotguns were used informally during the Civil War. But the first time really shotguns came into widespread use in the military was in the 1890s. Now, John Moses Browning designed the first successful lever-action shotgun for Winchester as the 1887. And then in 1893, he designed the first slide-action. Guess would help, huh? There we go. This one's just stiff. But a slide-action 1893. It fired 12 gauge, but it was an older black powder. Well, the 1897 was an updated model meant to fire smokeless powder 2 3/4 shells. And what I have in my hands is a Chinese and Norinco copy imported by IAC a few years ago of the 1897 Trench Gun. This is what America used. It is really stiff. I should figure out why. It also will do the slam fire. Anyway, so this is what was used in World War I, a copy of. The first shotguns purchased by the military were used in the Philippines, and they would originally just purchase what were called riot shotguns. They were normal shotguns. They just had short barrels of 18, 20 inches, sometimes 23. And sometimes they would also have sling swivels. Later on, though, the Springfield Arsenal, the Springfield Armory, the original one, would design this heat shield bayonet lug shroud assembly with front sling swivel for use on various guns. It was most famously used on the 1897 Trench Gun, but in World War I, the U.S. military had as many as half a dozen different pump shotguns in service. This was just the one that was purchased most numerously. I couldn't find an exact purchase number, but it looks like over 50,000 were bought during World War I. Other shotguns that were also used in that war were the very unique but also more finicky Remington Model 10, which would later evolve in the product line into the 17, the 29, the 31, and eventually the 870. But the Model 10 is an interesting critter designed by Pedersen of the Pedersen device fame. It was a very complicated gun, well made, but very complicated and often hard to keep running. Also, now the 1897 one was made by Winchester, and we've got a hammer here. There was the 1912, which was adopted as the M12 by Winchester, which was essentially the same gun as this, but with the internal hammer. And that was designed, the Browning design was updated by Thomas Cross Johnson. So you'll see an improved Winchester also in use in World War I. But this is a pretty conventional slide action shotgun. Really one of the first. I'm sure if you got your hand up there and were hit by that, that would be tons of fun. The release is right here. If you hold the trigger down, as you saw earlier, the hammer will keep going forward and you just keep shooting as fast as you can rack it. We have a 5+1 tube. We have front and rear sling swivels. And these Chinese copies are actually quite well done, especially from when they came in and they were affordable and inexpensive. Original World War I or even World War II trench guns are very expensive and very hard to find in good shape. Also, there is some question about shooting it with more modern loads. When the combat shotgun first debuted, it was in 12 gauge and it had either brass or later paper cartridges. Plastic cartridges were nowhere invented at that time, so either brass or paper. Most often they would be 00 buckshot with 9 pellets that were 33 caliber, so just a little bit bigger than a lot of pistol rounds. And the benefits with a shotgun were that you could have a lot easier chance of hitting your target at close range. The drawbacks were that the pellets didn't do near as much damage. Also, the ammo was a lot heavier than other ammo. For example, just to kind of cut forward to the more modern times, 223 weighed about a fourth or even a fifth lighter than 12 gauge shells in Vietnam, depending on if you had paper, plastic cartridges or whatnot. So it's larger. Most soldiers can only carry 100 rounds or even less of 12 gauge, so that was a limiting factor. But yeah, the trench gun, the 1897, was used extensively in World War I, and every website you go to that talks about these will mention that Germany protested their use, saying that they violated the Geneva Convention. Literally every website you go to will mention that. But there were quite a few different shotguns. The military really didn't have trials for shotguns. They pretty much took whatever decent off-the-shelf shotguns were available, marshaled them, added marshal features as needed, and sent them into combat. You had the trench gun with a 20-inch barrel, and you had riot guns with 18-inch barrels. Later, you would also see the military buying longer barreled versions, 26, 28-inch guns in different types for either training or frankly just skeet shooting for bases, to have guys again where they can check them out on the base and have recreational shooting. Thankfully, our second shooting session went much better. This is one of the new Ithaca Inland M37 Trench Gun reproductions that they're really trying hard to make look just like a Vietnam-era gun, hence the parkerized finish, the heat shield, of course. It accepts the standard 1917 bayonet and the 20-inch barrel with 4+1 tube. It also has the plain Jane wood furniture and the original style, just thin plastic or hard rubber recoil pad. So they did a good job. I'm happy to report that this gun did shoot very well. No issues whatsoever. Nice smooth action right out of the box. This is a really neat gun. In fact, I remember talking with the owner of the new Ithaca here a few years ago and suggesting that they do a reproduction trench gun, and I'm sure lots of other people suggested the same thing to him, and I'm glad to see they did it. Ithaca makes the gun, and then Inland makes the heat shield and adds it, and then they sell it. I really like this gun. What I don't like is the price tag. These are pretty pricey at around $1,200 retail MSRP. Street price is a little cheaper, but it is a lot of money. But then again, an original is $3,000, even more. So I guess everything's relative. But that's really the only complaint, or only thing I can say is the price tag. And I'm sure they have their reasons. Probably they're just not making these in very large numbers. But this is definitely a classic Vietnam type shotgun. Even though other models like the Stevens were used more extensively, when you think of Vietnam era slide action, pump action shotguns, this is exactly what comes to mind. And I've always been partial to the Ithaca. It's just a really smooth action. And these reproductions do have very nice feeling triggers too. Alright, we'll move on. So after World War I, the U.S. military had quite a few trench gun and other riot type shotguns in inventory. They had purchased about 100,000 different models, especially the Model 12 and the Model 97, with other smaller purchases, as I said, too. But a lot of these were still in stocks. I mean, a lot of them were lost in the war, but a lot were still available, and so they used them throughout the 20s and 30s. Now, the Remington Model 10 would start to be retired out in the 30s. It was an overly complicated gun for what it was, and so as they broke down, they pretty much just phased them out. They would buy some Remington Model 31s, but then World War II came around. And in World War II, you'll see even more shotguns. They would purchase about another 40,000 M97s. They would purchase about 80,500 M12s during World War II. They would also purchase the Stevens 520, 30, and the Stevens 620A would come later. So you're going to see quite a few. You'll also see the semi-automatic Remington Model 11 come around. But those weren't really for frontline use. They would purchase them with a 20-inch barrel for guard duty and 26-inch barrel for gunnery training. And they would actually put a cuts compensator on them and mount them. So it's kind of a cheap way to train air crewmen on how to, gun from a bomber. One new gun that would appear in World War II was the Ithaca Model 37. They wouldn't make many of the trench gun variety in World War II. Ithaca wouldn't. Fewer than 2,000, I think around 1,500. But it does show the Marshall version of the Ithaca. Now, like the Model 97 before it, the base rifle for the Ithaca 37 was designed by John Moses Browning. It was also worked on at Remington for a time, and then eventually made its way to Ithaca once certain patents ran out. This is a unique shotgun in that it doesn't have a side ejection port. You load and shells eject from the bottom. Pretty neat design, really. And this would also slam fire. Now it uses a very similar bayonet shroud type housing here. This still takes the 1917 bayonet like the 97. Of course, this is not an original. This is a reproduction made by Inland and Ithaca in modern day, but it's made very closely to the original. The ones from World War II were blued, and so yeah, the U.S. would go to war with even more shotguns in World War II. Many of these would stay in service through Korea, and then would come into Vietnam. Now, by the Vietnam era, a lot of the old shotguns, especially the Winchesters, were wearing out. So they would need to replace them. Starting around 62 and 63, the U.S. military would start new contracts for various riot and trench guns. Now, they would order quite a few Ithacas, about 22,000. Some were for use by the U.S. military, others were used by Vietnamese allies. They would also order the Stevens Model 77E, quite in large numbers. And at the beginning of the war, there were quite a few 520s still in service. Also, backtracking for a second, there was the Savage 720, which was very similar to the Remington Model 11. It was a semi-automatic, again, mostly used for guard duty and training. As you can hear, they had a lot of types of shotguns in use because there wasn't one procurement. It was just, whatever was available, they would adopt. Pretty neat gun, these Ithacas. They would adopt a riot version of this as well as the trench gun. The riot would have a shorter barrel. This has a 4+1 tube, still firing 12 gauge. The originals fired 2 3/4. The more modern ones can also handle 3-inch Magnum. But yeah, as the war ran on, they needed more and more shotguns. It was a very good weapon for combat in the jungles, being close ranged and giving a wide field to shoot. So they would start purchasing newer guns. One such gun towards the late 60s was the Remington 870. This is a police Magnum version in a riot configuration with an 18-inch barrel and 4+1 tube. The Remingtons in the military were kind of interesting. Most of them were basically off-the-shelf guns. A lot of them later would be Parkerized, but originally they were blued. Now, the Marines did have what they called the M870 Mark I, which was a somewhat specialized version. It had a 21-inch barrel with rifle sights. It had a 6+1 or 7+1 tube, depending on who you ask. And it took the more modern M7 bayonet of the M16. Now, interestingly, the Mark I did not have a heat shield. So I've never really seen a military 870 with a heat shield. But they would start buying these around 68, 69. They would also buy the Winchester Model 1200. Now, they liked the Model 12. It worked really well, but it was made with kind of old world manufacturing techniques, and by the 60s it was too expensive to produce and purchase for the military. The 1200 had an alloy receiver, which made it lighter and cheaper, and it used a rotating bolt system. And it was a good shotgun. Many don't consider it quite as robust and durable as some of the others, but for military use, it worked fine. In fact, up until recently, you could still hear of some Model 12s in armories and arsenals, really out of disuse, but still technically in inventory. So that's kind of interesting. But the Model 1200 stayed in service for a really long time. And again, they would just kind of buy whatever shotguns they could find. Another one was the Stevens Model 77E, as I said. It was interesting. They bought it in a riot configuration. It had sling swivels, but no bayonet lug. And I believe it was the first U.S. shotgun to feature a rubber recoil pad. I think they started buying those in the mid-60s. But again, they didn't have official trials to choose one. They just bought whatever. And really firm numbers are hard to find too. I mean, I've read about just different numbers here and there, but it wasn't in large numbers. Most were purchased in units of 10 or 20,000. A few like the Stevens, I think they made as many as 50,000 for the military. But again, not all of these were going to the U.S. A lot of them were going to U.S. allies like the South Vietnamese. But the shotgun was very important in Vietnam, so it kind of continued a tradition that spanned all the way back to World War I. In that war, it was used to clear trenches because of its size and utility. World War II, it was really popular in the Pacific for clearing jungles and caves and whatnot. Korea, it was still in widespread use. In Vietnam, it was still well respected. It had limitations, but when it was used properly, it was really good. It was also good for guarding prisoners with, especially ones with bayonet lugs. It just kind of gave a nice weapon to put in the side of a guardhouse too, just to be there and easy to train soldiers on how to use. I'm not really talking about the mechanics of these much because almost all pump action shotguns are pretty well the same. The Ithaca ejects from the bottom, but these are all slide actions with the under barrel tube, and they all have a bolt that locks in either to the receiver, or later most guns will lock in directly to the barrel. The Remington here has a steel receiver, as does the Ithaca. Like I said, the later Winchesters would have alloy. And yeah, that's about it I can say on these for the Vietnam type guns. And we'll do a blog article with more details and stuff, but wanted to really start talking about Marshall type shotguns. We'll move on. Well, we looked at the kind of the historical trench guns and a riot gun and talked about what the military used. But the shotgun is still very much a piece of kit in the military today. Now, the most common pump in service is a Mossberg, but there's several different varieties. After Vietnam, the military would purchase more 870s, and they would also start to purchase Mossberg 500s. The original 500 was released in 1960, and military guns seemed to be acquired sometime in late Vietnam. The first ones were just off the shelf, but soon they would go to a militarized version of the 500, mostly having a metal safety and a metal trigger guard. Then the 590A1 would come out, which had a different type of end cap here to secure the barrel, which was easier to remove for cleaning and maintenance. Also, the 590 would feature a bayonet lug to take the standard M7 type bayonet. The 590 was only offered in 20-inch up until very recently. The final version of the Mossberg pump to go into military service is the one I'm holding here. This is a 590A1. Now, like the early military 500s, unlike the civilian ones, the A1 has the metal trigger guard, the metal safety, and it also has a heavier walled, get up here, heavier walled barrel. Still has a bayonet lug, and many like this one have a heat shield. Now, the military has purchased the Mossberg, be it the 500, 590, or 590A1 in many configurations. Barrel lengths from 14 to 18 to 20 inches. Pistol grip only, fixed stock, even some collapsing stocks. Ghost ring sights, standard sights, with bayonet lug, without bayonet lug. Extended tube like on this one that holds 8+1, or standard tube that holds 5+1. Lots of different configurations, mostly just depending on that contract. A lot of guys I've talked to, they were just issued or used standard off-the-rack Mossbergs, but there are special militarized versions like this one here that are also in very common use. It's a pretty standard pump, much like the Remington. Probably the biggest difference, like the Winchester 1200 before it, this has an alloy receiver, which saves on weight and cost. But since the barrel does lock up into the, since the bolt does lock up into the barrel, not the receiver, it's no different than on an M16 or M4. So you have steel on steel lockup, so it's plenty durable. These are also drilled and tapped for a scope rail or side or whatever you might want to put on top. That's pretty much it. Standard fixed stock. As I said, metal trigger group. And these do have a disconnector, so you have to let off the trigger. So unlike the earlier Ithacas and 97s, these do not slam fire by design, which is probably a good thing for safety's sake and other reasons. One thing I like about the Mossberg over the Remington is that when the bolt is forward, your elevator is up, which makes loading faster, easier. You don't have to push the elevator out of the way to put your shell in. I also like where the safety's at, especially for different-handed people. It's easy to toggle right hand or left hand. And I really like where the slide release is at. It's back here, where you can use it again left hand or right hand. Now the military purchases riot versions of these, as well as the trench gun version here with the 20-inch barrel. But there's a new role that the shotgun's been called upon to do that it wasn't originally done, and that was as a door breacher. A lot of times the shotgun today is used to blow the handle and the hinges off a door, and special breaching rounds are made for that. This is a M590A1 breaching gun. It has a pistol grip only, and we have a strap on the pump to make it easier to use by just two hands. Now the military version would have a 14-inch barrel with this 2 or so inch breaching device, as Mossberg calls it, a standoff device. Since this is a civilian legal version, this barrel is 16 inches, and with this device permanently attached to make it overall 18. This still has a heavy ball barrel like the A1, metal trigger, metal safety, all that's the same. Pretty fun little gun, although it does kick the snot out of you. Now this shows one of the problems with the Mossberg design. Ergonomically it works great if you're doing a fixed stock, but if you have a pistol grip, you have to kind of reach up to get to your safety, which isn't too bad. But if you have a collapsing stock on here, it gets in the way. Also, your release is kind of harder to get. It's almost easier to do left-handed if you ask me, get to your slide release. But that's one of the downfalls. With the pistol grip, I would say the Remington's a little more ergonomic, although I really like the Mossberg. Helps if I take the safety off, huh? Now this is kind of a custom gun. It came from Mossberg Law Enforcement. It's got the ghost ring sights, which are adjustable, and again the strap on the pump, plus the short barrel with the fixed standoff device. So versions like this are in use by the military, and often ones like these over here are converted over to these with a different barrel and stock for different roles. So the Mossberg M590A1, while it is the only shotgun to pass all the military trials and it's in widespread use, there are still plenty of 870s, more modern 870s in use as well. Originally they would be wood stock, first blued, later parkerized. A lot of times a fixed stock, but sometimes they would do the classic top folding stock. Sometimes with the 4+1 tube, sometimes with a 6 or 7+1 tube. Rifle sights, bead sights, whatever they needed to do. More modern, they would go to polymer furniture, and sometimes even a collapsing stock. Most recently, and quite neat, they've gone to the Remington 870 MCS, which is a modular gun. They make the stock easy to pull off. It's just held on with a dovetail and pin, so you can switch between different stocks or just a pistol grip only. And you can switch between barrels. Usually Remington sells the MCS as a kit with 2 or 3 different barrels, 2 or 3 different stocks, and so on. That way it's mission configurable. It's also very expensive. I looked at the prices, and a complete kit costs well over $2,000, so there's that. So the military uses mostly Remingtons and Mossberg pumps today, with a very few, if any, old Winchester 1200s still in inventory. But since we're doing U.S. shotguns, I would never pass up an opportunity to once again pull out my favorite gun of all time, at least when it comes to shotguns, the Benelli M4, or as it's known in the U.S. military, the M1014. This is often called the Joint Services Combat Shotgun. It is the first semi-automatic shotgun to be adopted by all branches of the military for standard issue. As I said, the Model 11 by Remington and the Savage 720 were in use, but they weren't officially adopted. They didn't go through trials and testing, and they were mostly used by guards kind of as an ad hoc thing. This was the first self-loading shotgun to be accepted, tested, adopted, all that, to go through all the rigors. We have several videos on this, so I don't really want to bore you here, but if you are interested in learning more about the Benelli M4 or 1014, check out a couple of our Benelli videos and we've got quite a bit on it. One thing I will say, although this is a very good and reliable shotgun and is excellent for certain uses, it is not a good door breacher, and there's other roles where a pump is still better. So that's why the Mossberg 590A1 and Remington 870 MCS are still being not only used, but still even being purchased. Because the Benelli is great at some things and not at others. Well, if you have any questions, please post them below and we'll chat U.S. Marshal shotguns. As always, thank you for tuning in, and this is Misha.